I'm going to spend the remaining few minutes talking about other aspects of this thing called Islam, the outer form, by looking at one or two controversies to do with Muslim life. Now, there are any number of these that you might usefully need to know about. Some of them I think don't require much comment. Dietary laws, for instance. Everybody knows Muslims don't eat pork, and generally, if they can, they will eat meat that has been slaughtered by believers. Muslims don't drink. That doesn't require much commentary. Gambling is forbidden, all forms of gambling. Taking and lending of money at interest is forbidden, although this is a big controversy nowadays. But generally speaking, the classical prohibition has been maintained. Family life, well, premarital or extramarital sex is regarded as a mortal sin. Aspects of married life, I think Mustansir will probably cover in his gender lecture. But it's not just limited to that. It's not just obvious forms of worship and family life, but it entails areas that we would regard as being political and economic and social as well. And this is the area where Muslims have been most uncomfortable with modernity. Another big generalization, similar to those I've made in comparing aspects of Islam and Christianity already, might be that the big problems for Christian religion over the past 100 years or so have been to do with theology. The historical Jesus, the doctrine of the Trinity, the justice of the idea of atonement, all of these are lively and often very creatively addressed issues in Christianity. For Islam, the big controversies have not really been theological. Largely, I suppose, because the theology is a lot easier. There's no idea of Trinity, of atonement, of incarnation, and all of these metaphysical difficulties. Well, like Jewish theology, it's actually simpler, easier to defend. But the controversies that Muslims continually argue about have been in the area of law, which we refer to generally as Shariya. This is where the big arguments are taking place in Islam at the moment. And there's a whole spectrum of opinions, ranging from radical forms of liberalism that will say, well, the Quran and the Hadith, when issuing laws about divorce or punishment or whatever, didn't really intend to lay down permanent principles that could be applicable in the 21st century, but were indicating a morally appropriate response to 7th century Arabia, kind of liberal opinion, rather like, say, liberal Jewish interpretations of Jewish law, to the other extreme, which is the Taliban and others who say that we have to adhere to an absolutely atemporal, literal application of medieval Islamic law, and there's no possibility for substantive reform. Most Muslims are somewhere in the middle. Who is going to prevail in the end, I can't guess. Nobody knows. The trajectory of Islam and Islamic thought over the past 50 years has been pretty unpredictable. The whole growth of fundamentalism, for instance, 30 years ago, nobody expected it would happen. So I'm not going to suggest whether in the longer term Islam will go in a liberalizing direction, which is in practice a westernizing direction, or whether it will retreat into a kind of scripturalist rigorism or a medievalist idealism. We don't know. The point I would like to make, however, is that there is no such thing as Islamic law, partly for this reason. There are Islamic laws, and there are Muslims who draft and believe in and implement laws. But there is no Islamic law in the sense that there is, say, American law, or English common law, or Roman law, or the Code Napoleon. The Shari'a is not a codified body of positive law. It is rather a big legal tradition that is internally highly differentiated. So whenever a journalist says the Taliban are imposing strict Islamic law, then the journalist clearly doesn't know the first thing about Islam, because whose strict Islamic law? There's any number of strict Islamic laws. We should be aware that as well as this modern spectrum of liberalizing, westernizing reform and the return to a particularly uncompromising literalist understanding of the scriptures on the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, there are also pre-modern differentiations. And of these, there are two kinds that are particularly significant. One is the difference between the Sunnis and the Shias. And this is primarily to be understood as a theological difference. So if I get a chance, I'll talk about it when I discuss Iman. But it also has ramifications for law. Shia law is, in many respects, quite different to Sunni law. An obvious example is the administration of zakat. Amongst the Shia, the zakat is generally paid to the hierarchy of religious leaders, whereas for the Sunnis, it's generally a more spontaneous, locally based phenomenon. The Shia will typically fast for an extra half an hour during Ramadan because of their interpretation of the relevant Quranic text. And there are areas of family law. For instance, the Shia allow something called temporary marriage, which for the Sunni Muslims is regarded as being unacceptable. That's just to give you a few examples. It's not an exhaustive list, but that's one differentiation we need to be aware of. The actual bases of the Sunni-Shi'i divide, I hope I'll come to in a later session. But for the Sunnis and the Shi'is have internal differentiations, but the Sunnis historically ramify into four schools of law, which are important enough, I think, for us to try and remember their names. All named after jurists of the 2nd or 3rd century of the Muslim calendar. In case you don't know this already, the Muslim calendar begins with the Prophet's migration from Mecca to Medina. That's the year dot. And they are associated not just with different legal figures in the early period, but also with different understandings, which were regionally based, of what interpretative tools are to be used in order to deduce God's will from the Quran and the Hadith. And again, I can't give you a detailed explanation of the often quite substantial differences between the methodology and the practical positive law of each of these schools. But the Maliki School emerges from 2nd century Medina, and they say that the authoritative source of Islamic law is the practice of the city of Medina in that time, because that's the best recollection of what the Prophet did. The Shafi'is are famous for limiting the sources of law primarily to the Quran and to the Hadith and to the companions of the Prophet. The Hanafis, particularly in their early years, integrated many more rational sources for interpretation of law, holding that the human mind is a gift of God, and hence we can know what is God's will with regard to any moral or legal decision, as well as having specific guidance in the scriptures. And the Hanbalis are the most literalist, and if you have to use the term fundamentalist, of the categories. They're strict literalists, Quran and Hadith. And as we'll see next time, these also have certain theological implications, because the methodology that, say, the Hanbalis apply to reading the Quran doesn't just affect their interpretation of the law, but also the way in which they do their theology. But for now, I'll just speak about the law. These are regionally differentiated for various historical reasons. So West and North Africa is overwhelmingly Maliki, which means that if you go into a mosque in Nigeria or Senegal, when people pray, they will usually hold their hands by their sides rather than clasping them over the chest, because that's the way Malik did it. The Shafi'is prevail in Malaysia and Indonesia and parts of Egypt and Syria and Kurdistan and East Africa. The Hanafis, who account possibly for 75 or 80% of all Sunni Muslims, represent the bulk of Sunnis in the subcontinent and in Central Asia, that is to say Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan and the other stans, and also Turkey and the Balkans. The Hanbali school of Islamic law is by far the smallest. They have perhaps only 7 million proper adherents, and they are confined largely to corners of Syria, a famous town in Syria called Duma, which produces most of their traditional scholars, and also to the central area of Saudi Arabia, which we need to be aware of. since we're talking about divisions, because in the 18th century, a new interpretation emerged based on a particularly rigorous interpretation of Hanbali rigorism called Wahhabism. Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, 200 years ago, united Central Arabian tribes to launch a war of almost Calvinistic purification of local superstitions. He had in his gun sights things like Sufi practices of the veneration of saints and use of the saints and their tombs for purposes of intercession, and all other practices that he regarded as being medieval accretions. He wanted to sweep them away in a great reformation and return everybody to the pristine teachings of the Quran and the Hadith. Wahhabism was not terribly influential until the explosion of Arabian oil wealth about 30 or 40 years ago, when the Saudis started to export it throughout the Muslim world, and overwhelmingly Sunni radicals or fundamentalists adhere to the Wahhabi persuasion rather than a normative traditional interpretation of Islamic law. I can't think of a single case of Islamic terrorism associated with a Sunni group that was not Wahhabi. It's a particularly sort of, well, to my mind, rather dark and grim, narrow-minded purism that tends to end up being very intolerant. Osama bin Laden, obvious example, the World Trade Center people, they're all Wahhabis, they're not normative Sunni Muslims. Although, of course, the media call them Islamic fundamentalists, but that term really doesn't tell you very much. So this is the most obvious manifestation of the internal diversity of the Shariah. It's a tradition that speaks with very many voices, particularly now with all kinds of reformist movements, and also, of course, with the requirement to extend the Shariah to new situations that were not envisaged by the medievals.